The relationship between the United States and China has undergone a dramatic transformation over the past 2 centuries. What began as mutual curiosity and trade gradually turned into a complex and competitive relationship, particularly over the last century. From Cold War tensions to the modern-day geopolitical rivalry, the history of U.S.-China relations is intertwined with the evolution of both countries and their influence on the world stage. As you lie down at your best position to embrace this wonderful piece, remember to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so we will not miss out on each other, as we love to always be your companion. Leave a comment also as we go along. Thank you. The first significant interactions between China and the United States began in the early 19th century. For the United States, China represented an important market for trade, especially in commodities like tea, silk, and porcelain. The American merchants saw potential in engaging with China, although the relationship was not without its challenges. The Opium Wars in the mid-1800s, fought between the British Empire and the Qing dynasty, highlighted the competition for influence in China. Despite the U.S. not being directly involved in these conflicts, it was affected by the broader geopolitical shifts that followed. In 1844, the United States signed the Treaty of Wanhia, which granted American merchants access to Chinese markets, establishing formal diplomatic relations. However, these early exchanges were rooted in economic interests rather than political alignment, and the relationship between the two nations remained relatively minimal throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. For China, this period was marked by internal strife, with the Qing dynasty facing revolts and external pressures from Western powers seeking trade privileges. The most significant shift in U.S.-China relations came after World War II. In 1949, following the culmination of the Chinese Civil War, the Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, emerged victorious, founding the People's Republic of China, PRC. This marked the end of the Republic of China's control over the mainland, which fled to the island of Taiwan and began a long-lasting division between the two sides. The United States, deeply entrenched in the Cold War against Soviet communism, chose to support the Republic of China, Taiwan, and refused to recognize the newly established PRC. For the next 2 decades, the U.S. viewed China through the lens of the Cold War. As China became aligned with the Soviet Union, the U.S. responded by maintaining a policy of containment, supporting Taiwan as the legitimate government of China. During this period, the U.S. and China were on opposing sides of multiple global conflicts, most notably the Korean War. The war, which lasted from 1950 to 1953, saw Chinese forces directly clash with U.S.-led UN forces, creating a deepening hostility between the two powers. The tensions of the Cold War only served to harden both nations' positions, with the U.S. imposing sanctions on China and largely isolating the country diplomatically. Yet, as the Cold War progressed, the need to counterbalance the Soviet Union began to bring about new opportunities for rapprochement. In the early 1970s, the global political landscape shifted once again. The Soviet Union's increasing power and influence in Eastern Europe and Asia prompted the United States to reconsider its strategy in Asia. This led to one of the most significant turning points in U.S.-China relations: President Richard Nixon's historic visit to China in 1972. Nixon's trip was a calculated diplomatic move to open a channel of communication with China, counter the Soviet Union's rise, and help the U.S. establish a strategic foothold in Asia. This visit marked the beginning of a new phase in U.S.-China relations. Nixon's engagement with China was driven by the desire to exploit the rivalry between the USSR and China, thus fostering a new partnership with Beijing to strategically weaken the Soviet bloc. Nixon's visit resulted in the Shanghai Communique, a diplomatic agreement that recognized the existence of China's territorial claims, but left Taiwan's status ambiguous. It represented the first crack in the ideological divide that had defined the U.S.-China relationship up to that point. In the years following Nixon's visit, the U.S. and China continued to build diplomatic ties. This period saw increased trade, scientific exchanges, and a gradual thawing of hostilities. Both nations were motivated by shared geopolitical interests, notably their mutual desire to contain Soviet power. The 1980s heralded a new phase in China's development under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping. After decades of political turmoil and economic stagnation, Deng's reforms marked a shift towards a more market-oriented economy. Beginning in 1978, Deng's economic liberalization policies opened China to foreign investment and global trade. These reforms led to rapid industrialization, a transformation of China's agricultural sector, and the growth of a vibrant middle class. For the United States, this period represented both an opportunity and a challenge. On the one hand, the U.S. welcomed China's integration into the global economy. American companies saw China as an enormous new market, and the Chinese economy offered vast potential for economic cooperation. On the other hand, concerns grew over China's growing manufacturing power, its trade imbalances with the U.S., and its reliance on state-driven policies that conflicted with the free market principles espoused by the U.S. In 2001, China achieved a monumental milestone by joining the World Trade Organization, WTO. This move solidified China's place within the global economic system and opened up China's markets to more competition from the outside world. The United States, alongside other global powers, supported China's entry into the WTO, viewing it as a step towards encouraging China to adopt more transparent economic practices. However, by the 2000s, cracks in the relationship began to surface. As China's economy boomed, so did concerns about its trade practices, particularly intellectual property theft, currency manipulation, and state-subsidized industries. These issues, alongside growing military tensions in Asia, marked the beginning of the U.S.-China rivalry in its modern form. The early 21st century saw China rapidly emerge as a global economic powerhouse. By 2010, China became the world's second-largest economy, surpassing Japan. The shift in global economic power presented a direct challenge to the United States, which had long held dominance in both global economic and military affairs. As China's economic power grew, so did its influence in global affairs. The Chinese government became increasingly assertive, not just economically, but also militarily. China's military modernization program, which included the development of advanced missile technology, a growing naval fleet, and an expanding nuclear arsenal, began to cause concern in the United States and among its allies. By the mid-2010s, under President Barack Obama, the United States took a more strategic approach in Asia to counterbalance China's rising influence. The Pivot to Asia strategy aimed to reinforce U.S. alliances with regional powers such as Japan, South Korea, and Australia, while enhancing its military presence in the Asia-Pacific region. This shift was motivated by the U.S.'s growing concern over China's territorial claims in the South China Sea and its increasing military assertiveness in the region. However, the true intensification of U.S.-China rivalry occurred under the presidency of Donald Trump. Trump's administration launched a trade war against China, imposing tariffs on billions of dollars in Chinese goods. The goal was to address the massive trade imbalance and to force China to implement structural reforms in its economy, particularly in the areas of intellectual property rights, forced technology transfers, and market access. While these economic tensions escalated, the military rivalry also deepened. The United States and China have been in constant standoffs over freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, where China has constructed artificial islands and militarized them, claiming territorial rights over vast areas. The situation in the Taiwan Strait remains a potential flashpoint, with China increasingly taking a hardline stance on Taiwan, while the U.S. maintains informal relations with the island, including arms sales and political support. Today, the U.S.-China relationship is defined by an uneasy coexistence of economic interdependence and political and military rivalry. Both nations are deeply intertwined in trade, finance, and global supply chains, yet they find themselves at odds in numerous areas, including technology, military strategy, and global influence. The rise of China as a global superpower has led the U.S. to reassess its position on the world stage. The rivalry has reached new heights in the areas of technology, with China's ambitions in artificial intelligence, 5G networks, and space exploration seen as a direct challenge to U.S. technological dominance. Meanwhile, China's Belt and Road Initiative, designed to create a vast network of infrastructure and trade links across Asia, Africa, and Europe, is viewed by the U.S. as a strategic move to expand its influence and reduce the U.S.'s global standing. As both countries continue to grow economically and militarily, the U.S.-China rivalry shows no signs of abating. The future of this relationship will not only shape the destinies of these two nations, but will also define the geopolitical order for decades to come. The economic rivalry between the United States and China has emerged as one of the most defining features of the 21st century. What started as a trade relationship based on mutual benefit has increasingly turned into an intense competition, with both countries using economic tools to advance their global power. From trade wars and tariffs to the technological race in 5G and artificial intelligence, the economic clash between these two superpowers is reshaping the global economy. In this chapter, we will explore the factors behind the economic rivalry, focusing on trade disputes, tariffs, and the technological competition that is poised to define the future of the global market. The United States and China's economic relationship was built on mutual interests in the late 20th century. China's integration into the global economy, particularly after its accession to the World Trade Organization (WTO) in 2001, was viewed as a success story. The U.S. embraced China's economic rise, believing that by engaging with China, it could help develop a more open and market-driven economy. However, as China's economic power grew, so did its global influence, and the U.S. started to notice the consequences. In the early 2000s, the U.S. trade deficit with China began to expand at an alarming rate. By 2005, China had surpassed Japan as the United States' largest trading partner, and by 2018, the U.S. trade deficit with China had ballooned to over $500 billion annually. This trade imbalance became a central issue in U.S.-China economic relations. China's economic model, centered on state-led capitalism and heavy government intervention, was fundamentally different from the free market approach of the United States. While China had embraced global trade, its domestic policies were designed to ensure that state-owned enterprises dominated key sectors of the economy, and this created a sense of unfair competition for the United States. Moreover, the Chinese government's practices of intellectual property theft, forced technology transfers, and the lack of market access for foreign companies led to mounting frustrations in Washington. The economic tension reached a boiling point under President Donald Trump, who made the trade deficit with China a central issue of his administration. His America First policy sought to reverse what he saw as the economic disadvantage faced by the U.S. in its relationship with China. This brought about the most intense period of economic conflict between the two nations. In 2018, the United States launched a trade war against China, marking a new chapter in their economic rivalry. Under President Trump, the U.S. imposed tariffs on Chinese goods, accusing China of unfair trade practices, including intellectual property theft and forced technology transfers. These tariffs targeted a wide range of Chinese products, including steel, aluminum, and electronics, with the goal of reducing the U.S. trade deficit and forcing China to change its economic practices. China retaliated with its own tariffs on American goods, including agricultural products, soybeans, and automobiles. The trade war escalated as both sides imposed additional rounds of tariffs, resulting in billions of dollars in trade being affected. For the U.S., the tariffs were intended to pressure China into making concessions on trade and intellectual property, but they also created significant disruption in global supply chains, particularly in industries like technology, manufacturing, and agriculture. The tariffs and retaliatory measures had mixed results. On one hand, they were effective in bringing China to the negotiation table. In January 2020, the two countries signed the Phase 1 trade agreement, which included promises from China to purchase more U.S. goods, particularly agricultural products. China also agreed to address some of the intellectual property issues raised by the U.S., including the protection of patents and copyrights. However, the trade war also had significant consequences. The tariffs led to higher costs for American consumers, especially in industries reliant on Chinese imports. The agricultural sector was particularly hard hit, with farmers suffering due to China's retaliatory tariffs on crops like soybeans. The broader impact on global supply chains was also substantial, as manufacturers scrambled to adapt to the new tariff regime, leading to disruptions in production and trade flows. While the trade war dominated the headlines, a more profound economic competition was unfolding in the realm of technology. Over the past 2 decades, technology has become the new frontier of economic rivalry between the US and China, with both countries vying for supremacy in fields such as 5G, artificial intelligence, AI, quantum computing, and renewable energy. This technological race is seen as crucial for future economic and military dominance. One of the key battlegrounds in this technology competition is 5G. The rollout of 5G networks promises to revolutionize industries such as telecommunications, autonomous vehicles, healthcare, and manufacturing. For both the US and China, being the leader in 5G technology is seen as critical to securing their position in the global economy. Huawei, China's telecom giant, emerged as the leader in 5G technology. By 2018, Huawei had become the world's largest supplier of 5G equipment, with its technology being used in networks across Europe, Asia, and Africa. However, the US government, citing national security concerns, accused Huawei of having ties to the Chinese government and claimed that its equipment could be used for espionage. As a result, the Trump administration imposed a ban on Huawei, prohibiting US companies from selling critical components to the Chinese firm. In response, China began to ramp up its efforts to develop its own 5G network infrastructure, leading to a global race to deploy 5G technology. The US government, in an effort to curb China's dominance, pushed European and other allies to exclude Huawei from their 5G networks. This global tech rivalry has sparked concerns about cybersecurity and the role of Chinese companies in building critical infrastructure worldwide. Alongside 5G, artificial intelligence has become another key battleground. AI is poised to transform industries ranging from healthcare to finance to national defense, and both the US and China are heavily investing in this technology. The US has long been the leader in AI research, with Silicon Valley home to some of the world's most powerful tech companies like Google, Microsoft, and IBM. However, China has emerged as a formidable challenger, with the Chinese government making AI development a top priority. In 2017, China released a national AI development plan, with the goal of becoming the global leader in AI by 2030. The country's massive population, data collection capabilities, and state-driven approach to technological development have given China a unique advantage in the race for AI dominance. In contrast, the US maintains a more decentralized approach, with private companies driving innovation. This has led to a competition not only in developing AI, but also in setting the global standards and ethics around the technology. A major source of tension in the US-China economic relationship has been the issue of intellectual property, IP, rights and technology transfer. For years, the US has accused China of engaging in practices that undermine intellectual property protection, including forced technology transfers, IP theft, and the use of state-owned enterprises to gain access to sensitive technology. In many cases, foreign companies looking to do business in China have been required to share their proprietary technology with Chinese firms in exchange for market access. This has led to concerns that Chinese companies were benefiting from advanced technologies developed by Western firms without paying for the intellectual property. The US government, under both the Obama and Trump administrations, has pushed for China to adopt stronger protections for intellectual property and to stop the practice of forced technology transfer. The trade war was, in part, a response to these ongoing concerns. The Phase 1 trade agreement, signed in 2020, addressed some of these issues, with China agreeing to strengthen its IP protections and curb forced technology transfers. However, critics argue that these changes are insufficient and that China continues to find ways to exploit gaps in international IP law. While the US has been focused on reducing China's economic footprint, China has been working to expand its influence globally through its Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. Launched in 2013 by President Xi Jinping, the BRI aims to create a vast network of infrastructure projects connecting China to countries across Asia, Europe, Africa, and Latin America. The initiative includes the construction of roads, railways, ports, and energy pipelines, all designed to facilitate trade and investment between China and its partners. The BRI has been a key tool in China's broader strategy to increase its global economic influence. Through these projects, China has been able to secure access to critical resources, establish trade routes, and gain strategic footholds in key regions. While the BRI has been hailed as a means of fostering economic development in underdeveloped regions, it has also raised concerns about the growing influence of China in these regions and the potential for debt trap diplomacy, where countries become economically dependent on China. For the U.S., the Belt and Road Initiative represents a challenge to its global economic dominance. The U.S. and its allies have criticized the initiative, viewing it as a way for China to expand its geopolitical influence under the guise of economic development. The competition between the U.S. and China in this arena is not just about economic development, but also about shaping the global balance of power. Looking ahead, the future of U.S.-China economic relations is uncertain. While both countries are economically interdependent, their political and military rivalry is unlikely to subside. The U.S. will continue to push back against China's rise, seeking to maintain its leadership in global technology, trade, and finance. At the same time, China will pursue its ambitions to reshape the global economic order and reduce its reliance on Western powers. The competition over trade, technology, and global influence will likely define the coming decades of U.S.-China relations. The outcomes of this rivalry will have far-reaching consequences for global markets, supply chains, and economic governance. As both nations vie for dominance, the world will have to navigate the complexities of a rapidly changing global economy. As the United States and China vie for global dominance, their military rivalry has become one of the central aspects of their competition. Both nations have increasingly invested in modernizing their military forces, with a specific focus on advanced weaponry, naval power, and strategic positioning in critical regions like the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait. These areas not only represent geographical flashpoints but also symbolize the larger ideological struggle between the U.S.-led democratic order and China's authoritarian model. The South China Sea is one of the most contested regions in the world. Stretching over 3.5 million square kilometers, this body of water is a vital trade route, accounting for over $3 trillion in global trade each year. It also contains valuable resources, including fisheries and undersea oil and natural gas deposits. The geopolitical significance of the South China Sea cannot be overstated, and it has become a central point of military competition between the U.S. and China. China claims nearly all of the South China Sea, based on a historical narrative that stretches back centuries. The so-called Nine-Dash Line, drawn by China, encompasses large parts of the sea, including islands and reefs that are also claimed by other nations, such as Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Brunei. The U.S., along with its regional allies, has long opposed China's territorial claims, viewing them as a threat to freedom of navigation and international law. The U.S. has maintained a policy of freedom of navigation, asserting that international waters should remain open to all nations. As such, the U.S. Navy conducts regular operations in the South China Sea, including freedom of navigation patrols, to challenge China's claims and to ensure that the region remains open for global trade. These patrols have become a source of tension, with China regularly responding with military posturing and diplomatic protests. China's actions in the South China Sea have become more aggressive in recent years. The construction of artificial islands, some of which are equipped with military bases and airstrips, has intensified the situation. These islands, which are built on reefs and shoals, were once submerged but have been transformed into militarized outposts. China's growing presence in the South China Sea not only challenges the territorial claims of neighboring countries, but also raises concerns about China's broader strategic ambitions in the region. The U.S., in response, has deepened its military presence in the Asia-Pacific region. The U.S. Navy regularly conducts joint exercises with countries like Japan, the Philippines, and Australia, all of which have competing claims in the South China Sea. The U.S. also maintains a network of military bases throughout the region, providing it with the ability to project power and counter China's growing influence. This has led to frequent standoffs between U.S. and Chinese forces, as both sides engage in posturing and military drills. While the South China Sea is a crucial point of military tension, the Taiwan Strait stands as the most significant and dangerous flashpoint in the U.S.-China military rivalry. Taiwan, a self-governing island with a democratically elected government, is viewed by China as a breakaway province that must be reunified with the mainland, by force if necessary. The United States, on the other hand, maintains a policy of strategic ambiguity regarding Taiwan, pledging to assist Taiwan in defending itself, but not explicitly committing to military intervention if China were to act. For China, Taiwan represents a crucial part of its territorial integrity. The Communist Party, under President Xi Jinping, has made it clear that reunification with Taiwan is a top priority, and the idea of Taiwan remaining independent is seen as an affront to China's sovereignty. The Chinese government has repeatedly emphasized that Taiwan's return to the mainland is an inevitable historical process, and it has not ruled out the use of military force to achieve reunification. The U.S., however, has long supported Taiwan, both through arms sales and informal diplomatic relations. While the U.S. does not recognize Taiwan as an independent state, it maintains close ties with the island, providing it with the means to defend itself. The Taiwan Relations Act, passed in 1979, commits the U.S. to help Taiwan maintain its self-defense capabilities, though it stops short of guaranteeing direct military intervention in the event of a Chinese attack. In recent years, tensions in the Taiwan Strait have escalated as China has increasingly ramped up military pressure on Taiwan. China has conducted numerous military exercises near Taiwan, simulating invasion scenarios, and has sent military aircraft into Taiwan's airspace. These actions have been accompanied by a growing rhetoric from Beijing that Taiwan's reunification is non-negotiable. The U.S. has responded by strengthening its military presence in the region. The U.S. Navy regularly conducts freedom of navigation operations in the Taiwan Strait, and U.S. military aircraft have also flown through the area, often in close proximity to Chinese forces. The presence of U.S. forces in the region serves as a deterrent to China, while also signaling the U.S.'s commitment to defending Taiwan's security. For Taiwan, the threat of Chinese military action has loomed large for decades. The island nation has invested heavily in its own defense, developing advanced missile systems, air defense networks, and naval capabilities to deter potential Chinese aggression. Taiwan has also worked closely with the U.S. to modernize its military, receiving advanced weapon systems like fighter jets, missile defense systems, and surveillance technology. The Taiwan Strait remains a flashpoint because of the potential for miscalculation or escalation. A military conflict over Taiwan could have catastrophic consequences, not only for the two nations involved, but for the entire world. Given Taiwan's critical role in the global supply chain, particularly in the semiconductor industry, a conflict in the Taiwan Strait would disrupt global markets and technological production. Both the United States and China have been engaged in an extensive arms race over the past 2 decades, with both nations investing heavily in modernizing their military forces. The U.S., while maintaining its global military dominance, faces new challenges from China's growing military capabilities, which include advanced missile systems, an expanding naval fleet, and the development of cutting-edge technologies, such as artificial intelligence and cyber warfare. China has dramatically increased its defense spending over the last 2 decades, with a particular focus on naval and missile technologies. The Chinese Navy has grown to become the largest in the world by ship count, surpassing the U.S. Navy in terms of numbers, though the U.S. maintains superiority in terms of aircraft carriers and advanced naval warfare technology. China's naval ambitions are closely tied to its efforts to assert control over the South China Sea and to project power across the Asia-Pacific region. In addition to traditional military assets, China has heavily invested in modern technologies that could reshape the future of warfare. The Chinese military has developed a range of advanced missile systems, including anti-ship ballistic missiles capable of targeting U.S. aircraft carriers. It has also made strides in developing cyber warfare capabilities, which could be used to disrupt U.S. military communications, infrastructure, and supply chains. The U.S., in response, has pursued its own technological advancements. The Pentagon has prioritized the development of hypersonic weapons, which are capable of traveling at speeds greater than 5 times the speed of sound. The U.S. has also focused on the development of autonomous systems, artificial intelligence, and cyber defense technologies, recognizing that future conflicts will likely be fought in both the physical and cyber domains. As both nations continue to modernize their militaries, the global balance of military power is shifting. The U.S. faces increasing competition from China in areas such as missile defense, naval power, and space-based military technologies. The growing rivalry between the two superpowers in the military realm is not just about territorial disputes, but also about asserting dominance in the new arenas of warfare, including space and cyberspace. The U.S. and China's military rivalry is not confined to direct confrontations between the two powers. It also plays out in the broader geopolitical sphere. The U.S. has long maintained a network of military alliances in Asia and around the world, including with countries like Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the Philippines. These alliances are crucial for maintaining a balance of power in the region and for countering China's growing influence. In response, China has sought to strengthen its own alliances, particularly through initiatives like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, and the Belt and Road Initiative. While these alliances are primarily economic, they also have military components, with China providing military aid and support to countries in its sphere of influence. The U.S.'s military alliances in Asia have been instrumental in maintaining stability in the region. In particular, the U.S.-Japan alliance has been a cornerstone of U.S. policy in the Pacific, ensuring that Japan remains a strong counterbalance to China. Similarly, the U.S.-India relationship has strengthened in recent years, with both nations increasing military cooperation in the face of China's growing power. The U.S. also conducts joint military exercises with its allies, aimed at enhancing interoperability and ensuring that the region remains secure. These exercises serve as a deterrent to China, signaling that the U.S. and its allies are prepared to respond to any potential military aggression. Looking ahead, the military rivalry between the U.S. and China is only expected to intensify. As both nations continue to modernize their forces and expand their reach, the likelihood of direct military conflict increases. While the U.S. has long been the dominant military power in the Asia-Pacific region, China's rise poses a direct challenge to that dominance. The key question for the future of U.S.-China military relations is whether the two nations can manage their rivalry without escalating into conflict. The Taiwan Strait remains the most dangerous flashpoint, but the South China Sea and other regions of strategic interest, such as the Indian Ocean, are also areas of contention. The U.S. and China must also contend with the changing nature of warfare, with new technologies like artificial intelligence, cyber warfare, and hypersonic missiles fundamentally altering the dynamics of conflict. As these two superpowers continue to build up their military capabilities, the world will be watching closely, hoping that competition does not spill over into open confrontation. The Taiwan question has been one of the most contentious and delicate issues in international relations for decades. For China, Taiwan represents a critical element of its territorial integrity, an issue that the Communist Party has framed as non-negotiable. For the United States, Taiwan is both a strategic partner in East Asia and a symbol of its commitment to democracy and freedom. The ongoing tension between China's desire for reunification and Taiwan's insistence on maintaining its autonomy has been a defining feature of U.S.-China relations. This chapter will explore the geopolitical significance of Taiwan, the shifting U.S. policy on the issue, and the potential consequences of Chinese military action against Taiwan. Taiwan, an island located off the southeastern coast of China, has a population of about 23 million people. It operates as a self-governing democracy with its own political system, military, and economy. The political status of Taiwan has been a point of contention since the end of the Chinese Civil War in 1949. At that time, the defeated nationalist government, led by Chiang Kai-shek, retreated to Taiwan, while the Chinese Communist Party under Mao Zedong established the People's Republic of China, PRC, on the mainland. Since then, Taiwan has maintained its separate identity, But China views the island as a part of its territory, a breakaway province that must eventually be reunified with the mainland. The Chinese government has never renounced the use of force to achieve this goal, and the question of Taiwan's political status remains one of the most sensitive issues in Chinese foreign policy. For China, Taiwan's status is not just a territorial issue, it is a symbol of its national pride and the unity of the Chinese people. The Chinese Communist Party, under President Xi Jinping, has made clear that the reunification of Taiwan with the mainland is a central objective of its foreign policy. Xi has repeatedly emphasized that the Taiwan question is an internal matter for China and has vowed to bring Taiwan back into China's fold, peacefully or by force if necessary. In contrast, Taiwan has developed a robust democratic system with regular elections and a thriving civil society. Since the 1990s, Taiwan has undergone a series of political reforms, transitioning from an authoritarian one-party state under the Kuomintang (KMT) to a multi-party democracy. Taiwan's political identity is increasingly defined by its democracy, free market economy, and the values of freedom and individual rights. This ideological divide between China's authoritarian model and Taiwan's democratic system lies at the heart of the Taiwan question. For the Chinese government, Taiwan's status as a democratic society is a challenge to the legitimacy of the Communist Party's rule. For many Taiwanese, the prospect of reunification with China is seen as a threat to their democratic way of life and personal freedoms. The geopolitical significance of Taiwan is magnified by its location in East Asia. The island lies at the crossroads of several critical global trade routes, and its strategic position makes it an important military asset in any regional conflict. Taiwan also plays a crucial role in the technology sector, particularly in the production of semiconductors. Taiwan's Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, is the world's largest contract manufacturer of semiconductors, a critical industry that underpins much of the global economy. This makes Taiwan not only a political flashpoint, but also a key player in the global economic order. The United States has long walked a fine line when it comes to Taiwan. Officially, the U.S. adheres to the One China policy, which recognizes the government in Beijing as the sole legitimate government of China, including Taiwan. This policy was established in 1979 when the U.S. switched diplomatic recognition from Taipei to Beijing, in accordance with the Shanghai Communique. However, while the U.S. acknowledges China's claim to Taiwan, it does not explicitly endorse it. At the same time, the U.S. maintains a policy of strategic ambiguity regarding Taiwan's defense. The Taiwan Relations Act, passed by the U.S. Congress in 1979, commits the United States to help Taiwan maintain its self-defense capabilities, including arms sales, but does not specify how the U.S. would respond in the event of a Chinese military attack on Taiwan. This policy is intended to deter China from using force by leaving the possibility of U.S. intervention unclear, while also preventing Taiwan from declaring independence and provoking a military response from China. Strategic ambiguity has been a cornerstone of U.S. policy for decades. The policy aims to balance the need to support Taiwan's defense while avoiding actions that could provoke China into military conflict. This approach has been credited with maintaining peace in the Taiwan Strait for over 4 decades, as both China and Taiwan understand that any conflict over Taiwan could escalate into a broader war, involving the U.S. and potentially other regional powers. However, in recent years, there has been growing debate in the U.S. about whether strategic ambiguity remains the best approach. Some analysts argue that the policy is becoming less effective as China's military power grows, and that the U.S. should make clearer its commitment to Taiwan's defense in order to deter Chinese aggression. Others believe that abandoning strategic ambiguity could provoke China into taking more aggressive action. This debate has gained prominence in the context of rising tensions across the Taiwan Strait. Under the Biden administration, the U.S. has made some subtle shifts in its approach to Taiwan. While it continues to follow the One China policy, the U.S. has increased its military and diplomatic support for Taiwan. This includes more frequent arms sales, greater military cooperation, and a higher level of political engagement with Taiwan. These moves have been interpreted by some as a signal that the U.S. is willing to do more to support Taiwan's defense, without formally changing its one China stance. The question of what would happen if China were to act militarily against Taiwan is one of the most consequential in global geopolitics. A Chinese military invasion of Taiwan would trigger a massive crisis, not only for the two nations involved, but for the entire world. The consequences of such an action would be far-reaching, with potentially catastrophic economic, military, and political implications. From China's perspective, military action against Taiwan would be able to achieve reunification and end what it sees as a lingering historical grievance. China has spent decades preparing for the possibility of military conflict over Taiwan, investing in a range of advanced weapons systems, including amphibious assault vehicles, anti-ship missiles, and cyber warfare capabilities. In recent years, China has also built up its naval and air forces, which would be critical in any attempt to invade Taiwan. For Taiwan, the threat of military invasion is constant. While Taiwan has a well-equipped military, including advanced air defense systems, it is vastly outmatched by China's growing military power. Taiwan's defense strategy is based on deterrence, aiming to make any Chinese invasion too costly and difficult to execute. Taiwan has invested heavily in asymmetric warfare capabilities, such as missile systems and air defense technology, designed to disrupt and slow down a potential Chinese invasion. Taiwan also has a robust network of alliances, particularly with the United States, which could play a crucial role in its defense. If China were to launch a military invasion of Taiwan, it would likely face immediate military resistance from Taiwan's forces. The US and its allies, including Japan and Australia, would likely be forced to respond, either diplomatically or militarily, to prevent a Chinese victory. While the US is not bound by treaty to defend Taiwan, the US's commitment to Taiwan's defense has been a key element of its strategy in the Asia-Pacific region. A Chinese military attack on Taiwan would have immediate consequences for the global economy. Taiwan is a major producer of semiconductors, and any disruption to Taiwan's industrial capacity would have a ripple effect throughout the global technology supply chain. Semiconductor shortages would exacerbate problems in industries ranging from electronics to automotive manufacturing, further destabilizing the global economy. The geopolitical consequences would also be severe. A Chinese invasion of Taiwan would fundamentally alter the balance of power in East Asia, giving China uncontested dominance over the region. This would shift global trade routes as well as military alliances, as countries like Japan and South Korea, which rely on the US for security, may be forced to reassess their positions. The global response to a Chinese military action would depend on the extent of the invasion and the level of involvement by the US and its allies. It is likely that the US would be forced to intervene, either directly through military engagement or indirectly through support for Taiwan's defense. Such intervention would risk a broader military conflict with China, a prospect that would have far-reaching consequences for global security. The United States has long been the dominant military power in the Asia-Pacific region, and its alliances with countries like Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines play a critical role in maintaining regional stability. The US has a network of military bases in the region, including in Japan, Guam, and South Korea, which would allow it to quickly project military power in the event of a Chinese attack on Taiwan. The US's relationship with Japan is particularly significant. Japan, as a key US ally, shares concerns about China's growing military power and territorial ambitions. Japan's self-defense forces have become increasingly involved in joint military exercises with the US and other regional powers, and the two nations have worked together to enhance their ability to respond to a potential conflict over Taiwan. Australia, a close partner of both the US and Japan, also shares concerns about China's growing influence in the region and has supported the US in its efforts to counter China's military rise. While the US would likely take the lead in any military response to a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, the role of other countries in the region would be crucial. Japan, South Korea, and Australia could play significant roles in providing support for Taiwan, either through direct military intervention or by providing logistical, intelligence, and diplomatic support. The future of Taiwan remains uncertain. While China is determined to reunify Taiwan with the mainland, Taiwan's government has firmly rejected the idea of unification under China's terms. The Taiwan question continues to be a defining issue in East Asian geopolitics, and its resolution will have profound implications for the future of the region. The path that Taiwan chooses will depend on a range of factors, including domestic political developments, the international response to Chinese pressure, and the shifting global balance of power. Taiwan's ability to maintain its autonomy and democracy will depend largely on its military preparedness and the strength of its alliances, particularly with the United States. As the rivalry between the US and China intensifies, Taiwan will remain at the center of their competition. The island's future is uncertain, but its significance in the broader geopolitical landscape is undeniable. The Taiwan question will continue to be a critical issue in US-China relations, with the potential for conflict always looming on the horizon. As the rivalry between the United States and China continues to intensify, it has profound effects on global geopolitics. Countries around the world are being forced to reevaluate their alliances, trade relationships, and strategic priorities. The shifting balance of power in Asia, driven in part by the US-China competition, is creating new coalitions while also exacerbating existing tensions. Meanwhile, the influence of emerging powers in regions such as Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia is reshaping the global order, as these nations increasingly find themselves caught between the two superpowers. This chapter will explore how the US-China rivalry is influencing shifting global alliances, the strategic responses of regional powers, and the broader consequences for global trade and investment flows. Asia has become the primary arena for the US-China rivalry, and as such, the region's key players are recalibrating their positions in response to the growing tension. Japan, Australia, and India, three of the most important regional powers, have increasingly found themselves aligned with the United States in its efforts to counter China's rise. These nations, once cautious about openly challenging China, have increasingly recognized the security and economic implications of China's growing influence in the region and have deepened their ties with the US. Japan, long under the protective umbrella of the United States since the end of World War II, is increasingly concerned about China's growing military capabilities, particularly in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. China's expanding territorial claims in these regions, particularly over disputed islands like the Senkaku Islands, known as the Diaoyu Islands in China, have led to heightened tensions between Japan and China. Japan's security concerns have prompted a shift in its defense policy, moving away from its pacifist constitution to embrace a more assertive military posture. Japan has been working closely with the United States to counterbalance China's growing power. The two nations conduct regular joint military exercises and have enhanced intelligence sharing and defense cooperation. Japan has also participated in multilateral forums, such as the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue (Quad), alongside the US, India, and Australia, to strengthen regional security and counter China's regional influence. Australia has also become increasingly involved in countering China's rise in the Asia-Pacific region. As China becomes more assertive in the South China Sea and its Belt and Road Initiative (BRI) expands its influence throughout the region, Australia has found itself caught between maintaining economic ties with China and responding to the growing security threat posed by China's expansionism. Australia has grown closer to the US in recent years, particularly under the leadership of Prime Minister Scott Morrison. In 2021, Australia joined the US and the UK in forming the AUKUS alliance, which focuses on enhancing defense cooperation, including the provision of nuclear-powered submarines to Australia. This strategic partnership is a clear signal of Australia's commitment to countering China's growing military presence in the Indo-Pacific region. India, historically non-aligned and cautious about becoming entangled in the rivalries of major powers, has also shifted its position as China's growing influence in the region has become a direct threat to India's security. Border tensions between India and China have escalated in recent years, most notably in the Doklam Plateau and along the Line of Actual Control, LAC, in the Himalayas. These border disputes, coupled with China's increasing influence in the Indian Ocean, have led India to strengthen its defense and diplomatic ties with the United States. India has become an important member of the Quad, a strategic partnership aimed at promoting a free and open Indo-Pacific. Through its partnership with the US and its allies, India seeks to maintain a balance of power in Asia while protecting its interests in the face of China's growing assertiveness. India's growing military and economic capabilities, combined with its strategic location, make it a crucial player in the US-China rivalry. While the primary theater of US-China rivalry lies in Asia, the competition is also reshaping the global order, with emerging powers in regions such as Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia finding themselves at the center of this competition. As China expands its influence through economic initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative, these regions are increasingly caught in the crossfire of the US-China rivalry. The decisions made by these nations will have far-reaching implications for the future of global power dynamics. Africa has become a significant arena for US-China competition as both superpowers vie for influence on the continent. China has invested heavily in Africa in recent years, using its Belt and Road Initiative to fund infrastructure projects such as railways, highways, and ports across the continent. China's involvement in Africa has led to economic growth, particularly in countries like Ethiopia, Kenya, and Angola. However, there are growing concerns about China's growing influence in Africa, with critics accusing China of engaging in debt trap diplomacy, where countries are saddled with unsustainable debt in exchange for Chinese investments. The United States, while traditionally less involved in Africa's infrastructure development, has sought to counterbalance China's influence by emphasizing its commitment to African development and democracy. Programs like the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, aim to strengthen U.S. economic ties with African nations, while the U.S. military maintains a presence in key countries, such as Djibouti, to combat terrorism and secure vital trade routes. As the U.S. and China compete for influence in Africa, African nations will be faced with the challenge of navigating the growing rivalry while securing the economic development that both superpowers promise. Latin America, traditionally within the U.S. sphere of influence, is increasingly seeing Chinese economic and political engagement. Over the past 2 decades, China has expanded its presence in the region through trade, investment, and loans. China is now the largest trading partner for several Latin American countries, including Brazil and Chile, and has invested heavily in infrastructure projects throughout the region. While these investments have provided much-needed capital for Latin American countries, there are concerns about the long-term implications of Chinese influence. For instance, countries that have signed on to the Belt and Road Initiative have found themselves deeply indebted to China, raising questions about sovereignty and political influence. The U.S. has responded by seeking to strengthen its relationships with key Latin American nations, particularly in the context of economic development and countering China's growing influence. Southeast Asia is another region where the U.S.-China rivalry plays out with significant geopolitical implications. Countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines are caught between China's growing economic and military power and the U.S.'s efforts to maintain influence in the region. China's territorial claims in the South China Sea have exacerbated tensions with several Southeast Asian countries, particularly the Philippines and Vietnam, both of which have competing claims in the disputed waters. The U.S. has worked to counter China's assertiveness in the region by strengthening its alliances with countries like the Philippines, Singapore, and Vietnam. The U.S. also conducts regular military exercises in the region, often in coordination with local forces, to ensure freedom of navigation and demonstrate its commitment to regional security. However, some Southeast Asian nations, particularly those that are economically dependent on China, are reluctant to fully align with the U.S., fearing that it could jeopardize their economic interests. The U.S.-China rivalry is not only reshaping political and military alliances, but is also having a profound effect on global trade and investment flows. The competition between the two superpowers is altering supply chains, shifting trade routes, and prompting companies to reassess their global strategies. As tensions escalate, businesses and nations are rethinking their reliance on China and the U.S., seeking to diversify their trade and investment partnerships. The trade war and the shifting US-China dynamic have already disrupted global supply chains, particularly in sectors like technology, manufacturing, and agriculture. The imposition of tariffs on Chinese goods and retaliatory measures from China have forced companies to reconsider their reliance on Chinese factories and suppliers. Many multinational corporations have begun to shift their production to other countries in Asia, such as Vietnam, India, and Thailand, in order to avoid tariffs and reduce their exposure to the risk of further escalation in the US-China trade war. At the same time, the US has taken steps to strengthen its economic partnerships with countries outside of China, including renegotiating trade agreements like the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, and seeking new agreements with countries in Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. These efforts are intended to reduce the US's economic dependence on China and to ensure access to new markets and resources. China, for its part, has sought to strengthen its position in global trade by diversifying its trade routes. The Belt and Road Initiative, which involves massive investments in infrastructure projects across Asia, Africa, and Europe, is a key part of China's strategy to secure alternative trade routes and reduce its reliance on traditional Western markets. However, the BRI has also raised concerns about the long-term implications of Chinese influence, particularly in countries that are heavily indebted to China. Emerging markets in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia have become key battlegrounds in the US-China rivalry. As the US and China compete for influence in these regions, countries are increasingly looking to diversify their economic relationships. Many nations are seeking to balance the benefits of Chinese investment with the need for access to Western markets and capital. The competition for influence in emerging markets is likely to intensify as both the US and China seek to reshape the global economic order. For many developing nations, the choice between the US and China is not always clear-cut, as both powers offer significant economic incentives. The challenge for these nations will be to navigate the growing rivalry between the two superpowers while securing the economic development that they need to prosper. The US-China rivalry is reshaping global alliances and investment flows, as countries around the world are forced to make difficult choices between the two superpowers. While traditional US allies like Japan, Australia, and India have increasingly aligned with the US, nations in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia are being pulled in different directions as they seek to balance their economic interests with the growing geopolitical competition. As the rivalry between the US and China deepens, the future of global trade, military alliances, and political influence will be defined by the actions of these two superpowers, and the rest of the world will have to adjust accordingly.